Live from London, this is BBC News. A fragile ceasefire in Sudan and the rush to get out 300 British nationals are flown out of the country. And these are the pictures as the first evacuees arrive in London. In Russia, the jailed opposition activist Alexei Navalny is now charged with terrorism offences, facing jail beyond 2050. And US officials say that the Taliban have killed the IS leader behind the Kabul airport bombing that killed nearly 200 civilians last August. Hello, I'm Yalda Hakim. Welcome to BBC News. We begin in Sudan, where thousands of Sudanese and foreign nationals are still trying to get out of the country during a fragile 72-hour ceasefire that threatens to break. Among them are Britons being told to go to this airbase about 20 miles outside of the capital Khartoum, from where they're being flown to safety in Cyprus. Nearly 2,000 people from 50 countries have crossed the Red Sea from Port Sudan to the port of Jeddah on a ship organised by Saudi Arabia. And tens of thousands of Sudanese continue to try and reach neighbouring Chad, Egypt and South Sudan. As thousands leave, residents in the capital Khartoum have spoken of their fears the world is abandoning them, with supplies of food, water and medicine running low. Meanwhile, former officials wanted for war crimes have been released from prisons, though the army says they have been moved to a military hospital. Well, let's go straight to our Paul Adams, who joins us from Nairobi. And Paul, I know you've been following developments on the ground, and really today has been about that fragile ceasefire that is really quite shaky as people desperately try and get out.
That ceasefire remains all important, and it has about a little over 24 hours to run. And in that time, we are seeing this round-the-clock evacuation conducted by a number of foreign countries, particularly the British at the moment, using that small airbase that you were just referring to. It is functioning. The officers in charge of that operation say that they are delighted with the cooperation they have been getting, both with their international partners, but also with the local Sudanese authorities, the Sudanese military that is, and that they will continue to operate the evacuation just as long as they can. The problem is not so much the situation right there at that base, but the difficulty that people are having in reaching it, because in order to get there, people have to cross through numerous checkpoints. Despite the fact that the ceasefire is generally holding, with some exceptions, it is still dangerous in Khartoum, and people are very nervous about getting out and driving through those streets. Plus, fuel and transport is in short supply, so it is becoming quite difficult for people to reach the airbase and thus pick up one of those flights. But it is continuing. In the meantime, there are fears being voiced about the end of that ceasefire. Senior American and British officials saying it has to be extended to give any chance for some kind of dialogue to end this crisis. But at the moment, the signs are that the two sides are getting ready for a resumption of hostilities rather than getting ready for sitting down around a table and resolving their differences.
Yeah, and as Britain and various other countries try to get their nationals out, and this evening, earlier we heard that about 4 flights had arrived, left from Cyprus to the UK. There were 4 more expected to arrive, depending on how that runway goes, just north of Khartoum. 50 million Sudanese remain trapped in the country, and they're desperately crying out, saying that we're worried about being abandoned by the world once foreign nationals have left.
They absolutely are, Yalda, you're right. You know, the fate of foreign diplomats and foreign nationals is obviously an enormous concern to a number of governments around the world. But a much, much bigger crisis looms, and that is the thing that the Sudanese population is afraid of, that this conflict could escalate and that they could be forced to flee themselves. We've already seen that happening, with probably 20,000 or more people heading south to South Sudan and west to Chad, and some joining those road journeys to Egypt and to Port Sudan on the Red Sea. But the UN is warning that if there is a proper resumption of hostilities, we could see hundreds of thousands of people on the move. and a complete breakdown of those services that remain in place today. Just one example, the healthcare system has been put under severe strain by the events of the past 10 days or so, with hospitals in some cases being targeted. The UN says that 24,000 Sudanese women in Khartoum are due to give birth in the next few weeks. Well, what's that going to be like for them? Will there be a healthcare system to look after those people properly? There are terrible, terrible fears lurking in the hearts and minds of the entire Sudanese population, and those are, those are fears that should be concentrating minds around the world as people concentrate on getting their own people out.
Yeah, I mean, it's a devastating situation when you frame it in that way. All these women waiting to give birth. I was speaking to doctors over the last few days who were saying that the hospitals are barely functioning. They've run out of beds, they've run out of supplies, they just don't have the most basic things. Nothing is arriving into the country. And so even the injured, they were saying, have nowhere to go. They were turning off the electricity in the ICU units. So we are seeing a total collapse here before, as you say, all-out fighting breaks out again.
Yes, and this was in a place, let's not forget, that until a few weeks ago, there was still just a glimmer of hope that this long postponed transition to democratic rule might be about to move forward again. That transition that was supposed to happen in 2019 has been delayed. It was delayed by a coup effectively mounted by one of the two men currently fighting that battle in 2021. The Sudanese population has been waiting patiently for that transition, and they know that this conflict is raging because you have two rival military formations for whom political and commercial and economic power and influence and interests are paramount. And all of that is putting the interests of the nation on hold. And so, it's a pretty sort of desperate prospect for those Sudanese who have no role, no part in this conflict that's being played out by two people who seem unable to resolve their differences on how two rival armies should be merged into one.
Indeed, and really, I was speaking to a Sudanese national who was saying that they're being punished for wanting a better life, better situation for themselves post 2019, when Omar al-Bashir, the former dictator, was ousted. So a devastating situation for so many trapped in this country, waiting to find out what happens once this fragile ceasefire breaks down. Paul, thank you so much for bringing us up to date there. Now, let's go to Port Sudan. We can speak to AKM Musha, who is the country director for Concern Worldwide. Thank you very much, Musha, for joining us here on the program. We're hearing about the various different routes that people are taking to flee the country. Many are heading in the direction of where you are. Just tell us about the situation there.
Yeah, the situation is very scary. All the people are really afraid about their life and safety. Many people are leaving Sudan, and even Sudanese are also trying to save their lives. Many of the people have left from Khartoum after the fighting happened in Khartoum, and some of them are moved to the other states where they find a safer place. Many Sudanese have left through different borders to Chad, South Sudan. Still, people are really, really afraid, and the international humanitarian aid workers and the embassy.
But when they get to Port Sudan, just tell us about the situation there. Are there enough supplies? What's the route out of Port Sudan?
Yeah, it's from Khartoum. Port Sudan is a long journey. It's around 900 kilometers. Even the convoy, even late convoy, which reached to Port Sudan with a huge number of cars, around 80 cars and 20 buses. It took 34 hours travel to come here. I was with the convoy, And in Port Sudan, is a huge number of people are here, and gradually they are being evacuated. As supplies, the port city is a bit relatively safer, but we hear some shooting, sporadic shooting is still here. People are afraid. They are trying to get out of the country using ferries and whatever they are getting.
A-
UN is facilitating that process as well. Um,
And is there
difficult to receive.
concern? Is there concern that once this ceasefire ends, fighting will break out and people will remain trapped in the country?
Definitely, it is. This is a big fear. If this continues, people will be stuck here, and the situation was not good before. 15.8 million people were in need of humanitarian support, but this fighting has increased the suffering, and we see that services are not being operated. Banks are not open. Health services is breaking down, already broken, and electricity, water, and the price of the food and other essentials have gone so high. The suffering is increasing manifold, and many people are getting into that humanitarian support
And
need.
so, what sort of numbers are we talking about in Port Sudan? We are expecting the numbers to increase, but at present, how many people are gathered there?
I think it's over, there are many different nationals are coming here. First with the UN convoy and humanitarian workers, it's around 800 in the convoy, but more are coming, continually coming. Some of them came without the convoy. And there are other nationals where different countries are sending their vessels and aircrafts to airlift their nationals, like Indians and other countries. They're lifting there and taking their citizens from here. So it's thousands of people are coming here to get out of the country.
And when people get there, are they being given water? I mean, as you say, people are making very long journeys. You said someone had traveled for 34 hours to get there. I know from Khartoum it takes roughly about 12 hours. When they arrive, are they given food and water?
Yeah, there are different, the UN system, when the convoy came, that was support was provided, but still many people are coming. They're finding their own food accommodation. It was hard to find accommodations. So different people are taking shelter in different places. Is not easy to cope with this situation.
And are you
Some people have
concerned
come.
that there's going to be a greater influx of people?
And the people who are remaining, they will try to find a safer route. And Port Sudan is one of the safer routes. There are some people are going through the Gadaref border towards Ethiopia. Already many of the aid agencies workers are on the road. So some of them have already crossed, and some are in processes. So there are other routes also being taken, like through South Sudan. Even concerned staff, one of the staff are waiting in Kaduguli, South Kordofan state, to being evacuated to South Sudan. So people are taking different routes which are safer.
Yeah, AKM Musha from Concern Worldwide, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News.
The first steps towards protecting the nation. Moderna, one of the world's leading vaccine manufacturers, has started building the UK's first site dedicated to fighting future pandemics. The focus here will be mRNA technology. Used in Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, it teaches the cells in the body to create an immune response in the event of infection.
We can use it in all sorts of different infectious diseases, so we can put different codes in, different messenger RNA information codes into your body, and we can use it for other infectious diseases, so flu, respiratory syncytial virus, and other such things. But then it goes a lot more broader than that. If we have another threat that can come, whether that be from birds or from bats or from somewhere else, we should be able to, if we can sequence that bug again, we should be able to learn from our COVID experiences and make those really, really quickly.
You're live with BBC News. I'm Yalda Hakim. The jailed Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny has told a court in Moscow he's now being investigated on terrorism charges. He said he'd been told by his investigators that he'd be tried by a military court. Mr. Navalny's anti-corruption foundation has been accused of being behind the bombing of a cafe in St. Petersburg in early April, which killed a prominent pro-war blogger. An investigator has said 11 people have now been put on an international wanted list linked to Mr. Navalny. He's already serving a lengthy prison sentence after being found guilty of fraud. My colleague Steve Rosenberg in Moscow has the latest.
Let's rewind slightly, because ever since Alexei Navalny was sent to prison in 2021 for alleged parole violations, he's faced more and more charges, more and more criminal cases, and more prison time, right? So he was then given another 9 years, convicted of fraud. Important to say that his supporters insist that all the charges, past and present, against him are politically motivated. As you mentioned, he is Vladimir Putin's most prominent critic. Now, last autumn, Mr. Navalny said that he was facing another set of charges, new charges of promoting extremism and promoting terrorism, and predicted that that could add 30 more years to his time behind bars. Today, what happened? There was a technical hearing about this new case to decide how many days Mr. Navalny will be given to look through, to study the case against him before it goes to trial. We're talking about more than 196 volumes in this case. He was given until May the 5th to study the case. At this technical hearing, he said that one of the investigators had told him that part of this case had been taken out and a whole new case made around it. He's also going to be accused of terrorism. So, in fact, there could be two more court cases against Mr. Navalny, and he predicted today that the terrorism charges could see him being given life imprisonment.
That was Steve Rosenberg reporting there from Moscow. Let's speak now to Maria Pevchik, head of investigations at the Anti-Corruption Foundation, which was founded by Mr. Navalny. Maria, good to see you again. We heard from Mr. Navalny, who described this situation as absurd. I just want to get your reaction on what you think about everything that's developing in the court.
I can't agree more. It is absurd. And I was very impressed by your correspondent, who actually managed to break it down in a way that it makes sense. Because, to be honest, it's just chaos. They just keep adding and adding and adding new charges. It's extremism, and now apparently they are separating terrorism as a different case and trying it separately at a military court rather than just a regular court. They've just dropped another case. I think that they're going to do another case for some sort of prison fight that was provoked with Navalny last week, and that's another 5 years. To be honest, I think it's about time just to stop counting this year. It's like it's a life sentence.
Is that what you all think, that it's going to be a life sentence ultimately?
It is a life sentence. The question is, whose life, Navalny's or Putin's? Like that's the only question here.
In the sense that you feel that eventually Mr. Navalny will be out?
Of course. Like Navalny and other political prisoners at the moment in Russia, and there are plenty. They all have this ridiculous number of years attached to their prison sentences, and these numbers are meaningless because the actual term is until Vladimir Putin is alive or until Vladimir Putin is in power, which is very likely is the same thing. So all of these people will be out immediately when Putin is gone, and the only way to ensure that they are out as quickly as possible is to just fight against Putin, fight against the war.
But do you think that, Mr. Navalny returned to Russia despite many people telling him not to? On arrival, he's imprisoned. You've been with him as part of this journey. You've been part of his investigations, part of his foundation for many, many years. Do you feel satisfied with the reaction of the international community and whether enough pressure is being put on the Kremlin to have Mr. Navalny released? Or do you think, given the sort of greater geopolitics here and the war in Ukraine, that Mr. Navalny is being forgotten?
I'm very thankful to everybody who still cover this topic, like you guys, like other news companies. I understand that it is extremely difficult to manage to keep one topic in the spotlight for such a long time. It's been more than 2 years his imprisonment. While being thankful to everybody, to every journalist and every documentary maker and everybody, every blogger, and just generally any person who still talks about Navalny, I have to say that, of course, on a government level, on an international level, many more things could have been done. And it's a scary and a frightening situation that, of course, the matters of human rights and political prisons have been pushed away to secondary positions, obviously because of the war.
So do you feel that these sorts of sentences, as you say, it's now become sort of just adding numbers, with Mr. Navalny finally saying, look, this is going to be a life sentence, or the way that you have framed it. But ultimately, do you think that this is about putting pressure on anyone else who dares to speak up against the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin?
Vladimir Putin rules with fear. Fear is one of the most important instruments that he uses to retain power. And of course, the sort of numbers, just numbers of years that we see, 30, 35, 25 for Vladimir Kara-Murza. This is all very Stalin-like. We all read about this in the books. You know, very few of our grandparents remember this. And this feels like a grand repression era all over again. And obviously, every Russian person who knows the history of our country is terrified of the history repeating itself. There's sort of numbers we haven't seen before. And the only reason for this unreasonable, ridiculous sentences is that Vladimir Putin wants us to be scared. He wants everybody to sit quiet, say nothing, and just obey
and is it working?
He's in power.
Is it working? Are people, because we don't hear the kind of opposition voices. When we think about the dissidents, they've either been driven out of the country, they've either been jailed or in many instances dead.
It doesn't work for people like Navalny or for other political prisoners. They continue to be outspoken and they carry huge risks every time when they say out loud anything about the war, like in public, while already being in jail. This doesn't scare them, but I have to admit with great sadness that, of course, for those people who are in Russia, who have no opportunity to leave the country or immigrate or anything like that, of course, it's working. Wouldn't it work for you if you were intimidated and threatened for good 2 decades in a row? Of course, it works, but we can just hope that people will find strength eventually to stand up against this.
Maria Pevchik, Head of Investigations at the Anti-Corruption Foundation, founded by Mr. Navalny. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says he had a long and meaningful call with China's President Xi, the first between the two since Russia's invasion. China says it maintains a neutral stance, and President Xi has so far refused to condemn Moscow's invasion. In February, Beijing offered a 12-point paper calling for a political settlement to the crisis. Here's our Kyiv correspondent James Waterhouse to tell us more.
Well, Kyiv will see this as a bit of diplomatic progress. Why? Just last month, President Zelensky signalled he wanted to speak to Xi Jinping of China. He even invited him to Kyiv after he met with Vladimir Putin in Moscow. But Xi Jinping decided not to make that extra journey. Nevertheless, we're told it was a long and meaningful phone call. We're not hearing much in terms of detail, but Ukraine is desperate to improve relations with China, a country that to date has refused to condemn Russia's invasion. It's even strengthened its economic ties with Moscow. So while Ukraine will see this as serious progress, there are still huge ideological differences on how to end this war, because what Beijing wants, and what we're told after this phone call, it sees negotiations and talks as the only way out of this conflict. Ukraine sees a military victory as the way out to avoid just that, any kind of political compromise. So politically, we've seen progress today for Kyiv. What difference it will make, we won't know just yet.
That was James Waterhouse reporting there from Kyiv. Stay with us. We've got lots more coming up here on BBC News.